Constantinou, Coordinated Access Coordinator, leading the way. And I'm joined by Rob today.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rob Alain, and I'm the Secretary for the PEI John Howard Board.
Before we turn it over to Ben here, just a reminder, you can find us on the John Howard Society of PEI website, John Howard Society of PEI YouTube channel, or on our social media. All right, and our special guest today is Ben. Ben, would you like to jump in and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm the volunteer editor of the blog that appears on the website of John Howard Society of Canada, johnhoward.ca/category/blog. And I've been doing that since 2017 when we started it. So I'm happy to talk about how it started or whatever it is you want to talk about, Josh.
Yeah, no, I think we have certainly. Rob and I were talking before we jumped on here, and we've got some things we're curious about. So we'll dig into that in a minute. Before we go there, we'll just, as usual, do a quick minute on any John Howard Society of PEI updates. So, Rob, if you want to jump in from a board perspective.
Yeah, Josh and I were just talking about this. The board has struck a subcommittee to review all John Howard Society policies from a DEI perspective. So what we'd like to do is there is a new national DEI policy, and we'll make sure that all the policies that we use within John Howard Society PEI align with that. That's one of our big focuses. I think you want to talk about the new spaces that John Howard is about to move into.
Yeah, that was on my mind for sure. So we are amalgamating our two offices here locally in Charlottetown. We do have another space out in Summerside, but we will be moving all into one space there at our downtown Queen Street office, which will be the first time, kind of, at least as far back as I know there was a time when I think we were just here, but first time certainly in a long time that everybody's been in the same space. So excited about that. It'll be nice to be able to just kind of cruise down the hall or around the corner and find a colleague instead of shooting an email or a phone call and trying to figure it out that way.
Yeah, and I was glad that the board could support that initiative to get everybody into one space. I think it was important for your executive director and for the whole staff.
Yeah, no, I think it'll make a big difference, and it'll be helpful for people in the community too to not have to figure out which location to come to and who's where and how to find us. We'll all be in the same spot under one roof.
Excellent. Yeah, and the only other thing I'll talk about from the board is we have a whole bunch of new members.
Okay.
The board is very healthy and it's growing. And if anybody is interested in joining the board, you will find a link on the John Howard Society of PEI webpage.
There you go. Always looking for more great people. A couple of program updates sort of related to that. So we have two new volunteers that have started with us, particularly with myself, Jane, and Amber in the Reaching Home program. So one of them started Friday and one of them started about 2 weeks ago. So they'll be helping us with a number of different things kind of related to projects, policies, data. So different things there. So we're excited to have them on board. This will be our first kind of kick of the can with volunteers since the pit count. So yeah, looking for another positive experience and sort of similar to your board pitch. We're always interested in taking on volunteers if folks feel like there's something they have to contribute to the work we're doing.
Awesome.
The only two other things to kind of recognize. So we've been working closely with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and we received some recognition for the progress that we've made in our community. We were the first community in Canada to meet the new standards for both general population of homelessness and veterans specifically. So we hit those standards towards the end of March there. So we got a spotlight in their newsletter. We got a couple of letters sort of for acknowledging that, and a spot on the website as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah. So some great work going on here. And that's a shout out to everyone in the community, not just John Howard. And then the last thing that, Connor and I often chat about when we're on here is our tax program, volunteer tax program. So that has officially wrapped up. That doesn't mean that we won't still help people with tax returns, but sort of the designated tax season has come to an end. And so for this year, returns specifically, not just people, but some people have multiple returns to file or multiple years to file. The final count was 965
It's an amazing number, and that's a significant increase over last year.
I think it's double.
Yeah, that's
maybe more than double,
that
actually.
is truly amazing, and what a resource for the community.
Yeah, so that's nearly 1,000 returns that without the help of the 3 tax volunteers we had and Tanner leading the way, that wouldn't have gotten done otherwise.
And that means there's people in the community now that are getting federal government supports that they might not have even been aware that they were entitled to.
Yeah.
So, I mean, talk about working towards end homelessness or to improve the lives of the community. That's a significant step. Yeah,
no, it's a huge benefit and a huge resource, and very proud of that accomplishment.
Yeah, and you should be.
So before, that was kind of everything we wanted to chat about locally. And then let's kind of shift gears here and go to more of a national perspective and talk with you there, Ben. So for folks that maybe don't know anything, kind of the term blog takes me back a bit to, decades ago when blogs first became a thing, and certainly they've evolved a lot since then. So why don't you just start off, if you can, with kind of a bit of a description of, what it looks like and how it goes about and what it aims to do?
Sure. So the background to the blog is this. I had my own, let's call it, encounter with the criminal justice system some years ago, quite a few years ago now. And I had a background in research and policy that made me interested in how it is that research does or does not affect what people do, how our institutions work, what our policies are, how people think, those kinds of questions. When I got involved in the criminal justice system, I began to look at that system and start to read the research around it. And what I realized very quickly is that this is a system where there's a very big gap between what the evidence tells us and what we're actually doing. We can go into that more if you want, but basically it's a system in which what we do is not consistent with what we know about effective policy and practice. And so I started thinking about what are some ways in which we might help in some small ways to redress that balance. So I had the idea that there is a lot of good work being done on criminal justice policy in Canada and elsewhere. In Canada by academics, by community groups like John Howard's and other groups. And this work is not well known. It doesn't get enough public attention. Instead, people's ideas about criminal justice are formed, in my view, primarily from 2 things: media reporting, which we know is very highly sensationalized, and television and movies, which are equally far from or further from the world of reality. And especially so because a lot of the TV movie world is the American criminal justice system, which is very, very different than the Canadian one. So I began to think about what are some ways in which we might be able to help people in Canada with an interest, presumably including the kind of people who listen to your podcast, to learn more about what's actually going on in criminal justice in Canada and what we know about effective policy and practice. So the idea came to me of trying to put this information out in the public domain. And the way to do that, well, there are many ways to do it. Obviously, a podcast is one way to do it. But my idea was just have relatively short written snippets that would talk about studies or reports or people's experiences in plain language that would be widely accessible on the internet. So at the time, I did not know Catherine Latimer, but I pitched this to her via email and said, is this something you'd be interested in? And with her very typical generosity of spirit, she said, absolutely, sounds like a great idea, and has gave me some access to the website. And so in September of 2017, we started putting up the first posts. And now 7.5 years later, we have about 260 posts on that site. They cover many, many areas of criminal justice in Canada and beyond. A lot of them involve the work of scholars and community advocates in Canada and in other countries. There's another stream of posts that are the experience of people who've been through the system that we also want to give voice to. So those posts sit on the John Howard Canada website. There is a category there if you go on their homepage under media, which is the blog. And so that's what it is. It's a series of 260 entries. The entries are typically 1,000 words or less. They take 3 or 4 minutes to read. And they talk about, here's an interesting study that was done that found X or Y that people would be interested. Here's what we know about a topic that people are finding important. Here's someone's experience that they're relating. And that's essentially what the blog is.
Well, you know what? First of all, thank you very much for volunteering your time to do that, and helping to build a well-informed public. And I think that leads to maybe better public policy and a way to undo some of the negative policies that are sent out there by the media and through movies and television. So from my perspective, thank you very much.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed doing it. I didn't think I'd still be doing it 7 years later, I have to say. But
isn't it always that way with volunteering, though?
Yeah, and I have to say, I've had the first couple of years I pretty well worked on my own, and then I started getting university students involved, and so I've had a really good group of almost all university student volunteers, and in particular, I now work closely with a woman named Emily Stewart, who's a PhD student at the University of Alberta in criminology. She started as a volunteer and is now an associate editor with me on the blog. So there's a whole pile of people who are contributing to it now in different ways or have contributed. And that's a lot of fun too, of course. Always more fun to work with a great team.
Definitely. So let's talk a bit about what the process looks like. So you kind of mentioned you identified a gap in terms of public perception or kind of what's available and then what's actually going on or the research that exists.
Yeah.
So how do you go about, deciding or choosing what you might write about or what kind of topics would be of interest?
Well, I'm fairly attuned to what's being talked about, but I'm really interested not so much in what's on today, what people are talking about today in the media, but as the longer term big issues in criminal justice. For example, we have a lot of evidence that locking people up for longer under worse conditions is not a way to reduce crime and improve public safety. We know that. There's a lot of evidence on it, and yet it's not widely believed because there seems to be a strong human instinct when someone does something we don't like to want to punish them. And so even though the criminal justice system says it's not particularly about punishment, in my view, it is mostly about punishment. So we've put out a number of blog posts reviewing the evidence, the various studies that have looked at these issues. For example, there was a very extensive what's called a meta-analysis in the research world in which a group of people in the States, as it happens, looked at hundreds and hundreds of studies of the effect of incarceration on later crime rates. And they draw conclusions from this whole body of research saying, at best, more punishment doesn't reduce crime, and it might actually make things worse. So there's a post on that. Or there's been a lot of discussion recently about bail. And we've done a couple of posts on bail, pointing out that, in fact, we have 3 Supreme Court decisions in this country saying bail is too hard to get, and that bail is not getting easier, it's getting harder in Canada, and people are spending more time locked up waiting for bail, unlike what it used to be 20 or 30 years ago. Or people's belief somehow always that crime is increasing, when if we look at the Canadian data over 30 years, we can see that there have been very, very substantial reductions in crime rates. So it's talking about those kinds of issues, and that it's not like you do one post on it and we're good. Now everyone just changed their minds, of course. It's not like I believe reading the blog is going to change many people's minds anyway who are already convinced. But these are issues you have to come back to over and over again. And you have to give people, I guess a big part of the point is give people whose inclinations are in the right direction, give them the evidence they need to support their positions. So I can go and look at the CCRSO annual report, the Correctional Investigators Annual Report. I read those documents, and then we do a post on them. But, most people are just not going to do that. They don't have the time or the inclination or potentially even the skills to do that. So we're trying to translate a lot of stuff that's out there. Similarly, there's a lot of great academic work being done in Canada. Most people who are advocates in this field are not spending a lot of time reading the academic journals. They got other things they have to be doing. So we like to take a piece of academic writing that's maybe 5,000 words with a lot of statistics in it and turn it into 800 words, plain English. Here's what the main findings are for people. And I've had a lot of collaboration and great support from academics in doing that.
That's great. I think your approach is perfect. Like, it's almost like an executive summary. And from a guy who spent a lot of time in the military, I learned to only read the executive summary, because otherwise that excess of information kind of blunts the messaging.
Yep.
For me. So I think your approach is spot on in that regard.
Yeah, people are busy. It's I'm sure you know this in your own work. Most people's problem is not, I've got too much spare time and there aren't enough podcasts for me to listen to.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the opposite. We're overloaded with information. So the trick is always distilling things and putting them in formats that allow people to digest them.
So how has the blog evolved over the last 7.5 years? I'm going to assume that because you've been involved with it for quite a bit longer, that it's easier for you to obtain information?
Yes. So one thing is that I've learned some of the main sources, and because I have a research background, I started to read a lot of research about criminal justice, and over the years I've read, I don't know, thousands probably of studies and reports. So I have a fair amount of background now, and I'm fairly able to see what is new, interesting, has a somewhat different slant perhaps than people are, than most people would be. There are certain things that are perennials. I mentioned, the Correctional Investigators Report every year and the special reports they do. Those are always worth a blog, because that work is always really well done and meticulously documented, but it gets almost no media coverage, none. And so people don't understand how bad the conditions in our prisons and even more in our provincial jails really are. Or to take another example from your part of the country, last year, the East Coast Prison Justice Society in Nova Scotia did a report on prison conditions in Nova Scotia jails. It was an excellent report. And again, I don't think it got a lot of media attention, so I was happy to turn that into a post, put it up there. We always link back to the original documents, and the original authors. So anyone who wants to go back and see the original has a way to do that. That's really important, and to give credit to the people who did the original work. But just putting that stuff out there so people can have access to it more readily.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like not only are you sort of providing something to the people who are going to read the blog, but you're also providing those folks that do the research and do the report with another avenue to get that message out.
Yeah, absolutely. The academic world, which I'm also pretty familiar with, people write journal articles, and those journals, your article might be read in 5 years. 200 people might see that article. But our blog gets several thousand hits a month. So basically, this is it's another way for people to get their work out there and draw attention to it. A lot of academics are not very good at doing that kind of public work. They don't entirely feel comfortable with it. They want to be sure that they've qualified things sufficiently and haven't overstated the case. I'm halfway in between a journalist and an academic, I would say. I want to be careful I'm being true to what was actually said, but I'm trying to distill it into a pretty clear and fairly simple message, because if it's too long and too complicated, most people just aren't going to take it in.
Yeah. So what is the ideal length for a blog for you?
Our posts I try to keep them under 1,000 words. The idea is, how long does it take you to read it? And
Right.
the idea is that when people see the post, there's a statement at the top of each post that says, 3 minutes to read, 4 minutes to read, whatever it is. But you want to be in that category where people don't say, that looks really interesting, I'll put it in my pile for when I have time.
Yeah.
Because we all know what happens to that pile.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Right.
what about frequency? Is it like every twice a month?
Yeah, we started out at the beginning. I wanted to build it up. So we did a lot. In the first year, I think we did about 50 or 60.
Wow.
Just to build up a bit of a bit of a cadre of stuff, of material, right? But of course, no one can keep up with that. It's like getting those emails in your inbox, right? Even if it's a topic you're interested in, you open up your inbox and you say, oh, not another email from them. Because we're just all getting 30 and 40 a day out of them. So with the best will in the world, people can't keep up with that. So now we're down to more or less 2 a month. We did a couple extra in April because of the election and, all the nonsense that was being talked about criminal justice in the election, particularly, but not only, by the Conservatives. But basically it's 2 a month now.
Well, we're glad to share it on our local John Howard Society of PEI webpage. Are you looking like you're trying to get the messaging out now? What do you want to tell the people that are listening to this pod that you'd like to see them do? Do you want them to share it? Here's your chance to pitch it.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, the more that people are aware of it. For example, this is a really good resource for students who are studying criminology or law. So if you know people who are in that world, just draw their attention to the blog. It's pretty easily searchable. And so you can find stuff on many, many topics that allows you to pick up a little bit of information and to become a little more informed, either for yourself or for colleagues you work with or other people you know in the community. It's a resource that we would like to see used as widely as possible. Everything in the blog is free for others to use. There's no cost. All we ask is that if it's reprinted or used, it be for a non-commercial purpose. And otherwise, feel free to go at it, repost it, link to it, whatever it is that you want to do, where you find it useful. We're also always open, of course, to ideas people have about content and contributors.
I think that's interesting for people to know too, that if, they have an idea or they have something they're working on, that they could potentially reach out and say, hey, would you be willing to do a blog post on this?
Absolutely. And every post at the end has my email address. So I'm easy to reach. It's just blogeditor@johnhoward.ca.
And you mentioned how you've got a couple of kind of go-tos, in terms of the annual reports that you write about. What would you say are some of the kind of prevailing or persistent topics that you keep coming back to that you're passionate about?
Well, yes, and in a way, they're the mirror image of all the myths that are out there. For example, the myth that we're not harsh enough, that we have a lot of crime because we're too easy on people. And of course, the evidence doesn't support that view at all. It supports the opposite view. Another myth is, well, you do your time and then that's it. But as you guys know very well, a criminal record every sentence is a lifetime sentence. And the challenges that people have trying to re-enter society are gigantic and very badly understood. I don't think most people realize how much punishment actually happens after the sentence is over. So that's another one that we want to take on. The idea that crime is rampant and, it's out of control and we need more policing. crime in Canada is not out of control. In fact, it's significantly lower than it's been historically. And then we have the example of the youth criminal justice field, in which we changed the law to be about 20 years ago now to make it less punitive. And as a result of that, we have a lot less young people going through the criminal justice system and ending up with criminal records. And we do not have an increase in youth crime. So we've got a perfect example in our own country of a very different approach that yields better public safety. Another one is the gigantic amount of money that the system costs. You know, we're spending, depending on what you throw into the mix, $5 to $8 billion a year arresting people, locking them up. And when you think of what we could do with that money, especially considering that most of the people we're arresting and locking up are people who have mental illness issues or addiction issues or both, or poverty issues, you know, you think about this is a gigantic waste of money. And we could be redirecting a lot of those resources to much more productive uses that would actually help public safety.
Yeah, no, that's well said. And I think that's certainly, fits with the belief system that we have in terms of restorative justice and harm reduction and all the principles that come along with that. And I think, like you said, it's counterintuitive to public perception, but it's important to help spread the factual information so people are aware of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, look, as I said, the blog is not going to change Canadian public opinion, but it's one little bit of the effort to do that. And what we know historically is where opinions on social issues have been changed, and we have many examples of it. It only happens because people like you guys are doing the advocacy work, right? Like, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, so but it's because people in all these voluntary groups across the country are doing the advocacy work and the slog work every day that eventually things do shift.
Well, I think it's actually, there's probably another byproduct that occurred to me, that you're having so much interaction with the academia world and folks doing research. And some of the folks that would be in those programs may not be as familiar with sort of the impact or the direct effect that this work has. And so you may be sort of educating or informing a subpopulation that maybe has some myths of their own as well.
For sure. And I do think students, university students and college students in these fields are a particularly important group. One of the things about criminal justice that sets it aside from other policy issues is that it so engages people's emotions. So crime gets people very, very angry and very, very frightened. And, we know about anger and fright that those are not emotions that lead us to doing more critical reflection and careful thinking. They lead us to very strong, quick responses that are not necessarily well grounded. So this makes criminal justice a particularly difficult one. You get a case that really offends many, many people. And of course it happens because people do bad things. And then everyone immediately wants to make everything worse for everybody. So we've got to try and help people think about this in a more sophisticated way and not assume that, everyone in jail is Paul Bernardo. Because in fact, there's only one Paul Bernardo out of the 35,000 people who are being incarcerated today in Canada.
Yeah, it's a great point. And yeah, like you said, being able to help that student population gain some more information, and then for them to spread that amongst their peers and include that in some of the research that they do moving forward. That could be another avenue where that impact is made. Yeah.
And also to see how this weaves into the political process. Because the reality is that politics is responsive. As one politician once said to me about when I was talking with him about what the research said about some issue that wasn't what he particularly wanted to do. He said to me, "That's very nice, Ben, but I don't think that research votes in my constituency."
Yeah, that is the challenge. That's for sure.
Absolutely. So, if people believe that crime is getting worse, then that's the political reality. And that makes it even more important to try and help people see that that belief is not well justified.
Right. Yeah. And if you could get a few people who are kind of on the fence about some of these things to put eyes on your article and your blog and see, okay, here's some facts, that might be enough to sway them in that direction.
It could help. And the other thing is the stories, because we're what I've learned. I didn't want to learn this lesson, but I have learned the lesson that people aren't very much persuaded by facts, but we're often very persuaded by people's stories. So when we tell the stories of people who have made good use of second chances, who've turned their lives around, who've overcome real struggles and done positive things, those stories, or stories of forgiveness and restorative justice that you mentioned, then those are things that actually help people change their thinking too.
Yeah, they resonate with people and they stay with them.
Yeah, much longer than any statistics will.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that ties into that human element that you talked about, and you talked about sort of the emotionally charged nature of this topic.
Yeah, but people also love second chance stories, right? People love stories about someone who is down in the depths and has fought their way back out of it and rebuilt something out of that.
Yeah, that's sort of the positive version of the Hollywood movie that you'd see, right?
Yeah. And we have many of those stories. I mean, again, you guys know this better than me, but if you think about your clients, there are people who have done literally amazing things given the conditions under which they grew up and the way they lived, and have been able to do fantastic things with their lives. And those stories need to be told more too.
Agreed. Yeah. And then we do a lot of our work now does include success stories. We do that in our reporting. We do that in a lot of meetings. And so that's like you're saying, kind of a version of what you're talking about there.
Yeah. If you look at boards across Canada for John Howard, probably our best goal is not just diversity, but it's getting some of our clients on the board. So they get that balanced perspective when we're developing policy, when we're talking about, what approach we want to take on issues. Just to have that balanced perspective and somebody to say, or call us out, and they'll call us out and say, you know what, you guys are full of shit. That's not the right approach. This is the right approach. So,
I think that, I mean, the process of getting arrested and convicted is very often a very public process, right? But the process of rebuilding your life at the other end is not a public process at all. And we don't really have we don't have good ways of recognizing people who have done that successfully and giving them credit for doing it. What's more likely is their criminal record's going to continue to be a problem for them, no matter what they've been able to accomplish.
Yeah, it's a good point because, like you said, your name shows up on the court docket. That's public information. You can go to the court and witness. You can see media articles about what this person, did or is convicted of. But then, like you said, when they're back in community and they've maybe went through a halfway house or went to treatment or reintegrated with family, that's all private information that nobody knows about.
Yeah, nobody says, here's your public award for being, 10 years out and living a good life and being a good, productive citizen.
Yeah.
So those stories are really important too.
I think that was just about everything I was curious about. Did you have anything else that you wanted to ask about there, Rob?
No, I think that's, it's been very informative again. We're really appreciative of your efforts. Like you said, it's a great resource. Junior lawyers, when I talk to them, I will bring their attention to your blog so that they can read and gain knowledge. So again, thank you for doing it.
This is another, if I may, there is a point about lawyers actually that is worth making, because often when you're defending someone, there are issues of expertise that come up. For example, you're defending someone around, say, addiction and related to addiction and treatment. Lawyers aren't experts in what happens with addiction and treatment, and they can't be. They've got a different job. So what they need is to have a source they can go to that helps them understand those issues without having to charge their client $5,000 to get an expert, which the clients don't have, right?
Yeah.
That's a good point around sort of training and education. And we had actually during our John Howard week, we had a professor on, Susan Bandes, who talked about.
Oh, she's terrific.
Yeah, so I think you might have helped actually connect me with her. So so she spoke about the role of emotion in law and sort of some of the impacts it has there, and talked about what should training and competency look like for legal professionals, and that ties into kind of what you're talking about of. Well, it's not just law anymore. The folks we are working with these crimes are being committed for a variety of different reasons or motivations. And you really need to have some expertise in more than just the criminal code.
Yeah. A really good example of this is the, what are called the Gladue reports. Yeah.
You do, for the Indigenous individuals.
That's right. Which the Supreme Court has kind of mandated because there was a recognition that people who've grown up in a certain set of social conditions are going to have a whole set of barriers that other people don't have, and a whole set of challenges that need to be taken into account when we're thinking about criminality, sentencing, and rehabilitation. Now, the problem with the Gladue reports is that they have not nearly worked out the way they were intended to, but at least there's a recognition that there are extenuating circumstances that we need to think about in terms of really creating the kind of public safety environment we want to have.
Yeah, and it really humanizes the offender.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a great point around that practice and how that can incorporate somebody's history and background and what would be beneficial for them as a person entirely. Yeah,
that's right. Because usually what the system does, because it's an adversarial system, the Crown wants to make the accused look as bad as they possibly can.
Right.
And that's not a good way to get someone thinking about how they can turn their life around and be a better citizen.
Yes. It makes them feel defensive, which is sort of the idea of a defense lawyer, I guess, right?
Yeah. And it makes everybody else think of them as, a piece of garbage, essentially. Why would we want to have anything to do with this person ever again?
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of work to be done, and we're glad that you're highlighting some of it. We're really appreciative of your time. Is there anything you wanted to put out there before we wrap up?
No, I just want to say, as a volunteer myself, I'm deeply appreciative of all the stuff, that all the volunteers do, the many, many hundreds of thousands of people across the country who are putting their time into trying to improve this system.
Definitely. We would agree with that wholeheartedly. We've had some local volunteers, and certainly there's a lot of national volunteers, and I don't think we could be where we are or where we're headed without them.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll be back on Friday, June 13th with another great guest and another episode. Until then, you can find this episode and all of our past on the John Howard Society of PEI website, John Howard Society of PEI YouTube channel, and on our social media. Rob, thanks again.
Oh, glad to be here.
Appreciate you jumping in. Ben, thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, gentlemen. Pleasure. Thanks for the work.
Take care.
Bye.